Hello, my name is Danny Nolan and I'm the Director of ChassisSim Technologies. And welcome to this latest ChassisSim video tutorial. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a real treat for you today. And to be quite honest, this is a tutorial that's been a very long time in the making and the waiting. And I'm really pleased to show it to you today. And that is tire pressure modeling and using this in ChassisSim. So, one of the key performance parameters that you'll ever use in a race car is tire pressure. And that becomes pretty obvious if you spend more than about 5 minutes in motorsport. What we're going to be talking about in our presentation today is we're going to be talking about how you generate it in a session. We'll talk about how to model it, but more importantly, we're going to talk about how it affects tire force and how to model that particular component, and also too some tips and tricks and things that you need to be watching for. So let's get started. Okay, so tire pressure, how does this build up? Okay, the thing that drives tire pressure is the internal tire temp. And what's really interesting about tire pressure and the internal tire temp is that it builds up very, very slowly over the session, and eventually it asymptotes. So if we take a look at this bottom trace, which is from a V8 supercar, take a look at tire pressure. Note how we start off at the cold value. It builds up, it builds up, it builds off, and then eventually it just asymptotes off. That, folks, is your telltale thing of not just the way that internal temp builds up, but the way that tire temperature, the way tire pressure builds up as well. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind, because it explains a lot of things, like particularly in terms of like how initially the tires can feel good, then all of a sudden, as the session carries on, all of a sudden you can get a car that's really oversteery or understeery, depending on where the tire pressure lands. Now, obviously, there are things that impact this, like tire energy wear that I discussed in another video. But effectively, it goes a long way to really explain what you see that goes on in a racing tire. Okay, so how do we model tire pressure in ChassisSim? So, and we're going to, and not to fret, we're going to walk you through a little bit of a demo with a model with this incorporated in. But this is really to show you where the knobs are. So, under the thermal properties of the tires, you're going to have a little setting set. Click here for internal tire temps. Then you've got a checkbox to say deduce internal tire temp. You've got a hysteresis multiplier, an internal temp multiplier, and you've got the parameters of the tire, like the tire mass, the tread width, the tread thickness, the gas constant, the tire CV constant that you can all dial in to suit what the characteristics of your tire are. Okay, so how do we model tire pressure in particular, tire pressure growth in particular, filling in what these parameters look like? Well, this is a spin-off of the ChassisSim track replay simulation. So what we'll do, and you can see the sections highlighted in red here. So what you'll be doing here, and this was done for a single flying lap to make sure that you got up to a particular operating pressure. So you'll start off by putting in your start pressures and your start internal temps. That is effectively the temperature you're measuring when the car comes into the pits. You put the pyro straight into the tire. You're not measuring the surface temp. You're measuring the internal temp. So you'll start with a front and a rear, and a front and a rear start point, front and rear end point. Now, let me walk you through these parameters here. So you'll click here to generate a data log file in Motec or a data acquisition package of your choice. Click here to remove the model safeties, and click here for direct slip ratio mode. And what that is that's sort of piggybacking off the driver in the loop modes to make sure that you get as much slip angle and slip ratio variation as possible. And in here, under this red thing, you'll be going through and putting in your monster files. Now, in this case, we're doing a single flying lap. Now, one thing that I will say, if you are modeling the internal tire temps, you don't know what the thermal internal temperature characteristics of the tires are doing, that's when you're going to click here to deduce the internal tire temps. If you're going to be just running a bog standard simulation, you click here to run the open loop simulation. Okay, so where are the tire pressures logged? So let me just go back to the sheet here. You've got a target data file when you go through the track replay open loop simulation, and you're going to specify a certain text file. And in that text file, what you'll find is the last 4 columns are the tire pressures. That's what you need to be, particularly if you're looking at using this to really get a good gauge to predict where your tire pressures need to land. This is a really, really handy tool to make sure, and that will actually log the tire pressures through the run. Currently, we just log it through there, but watch this space. We will probably expand this out to the various data acquisition packages that are supported in ChassisSim. So when you do a track replay simulation, that's all to hand. But again, I like to use this as a very, very quick sanity check to go, right, that's where my start pressures were at. This is where my end pressures are at, and I'll use that quite a bit. Okie dokie. So let me now walk you through the knobs of what this looks like in ChassisSim. So as promised, what I've got is a car model up with the internal Tyre Temps activated. Now, a couple of things that are going to be a little bit different from the standard lap time simulation model. So if we click on the front tyres here, take a look at that lower tyre temp. That's basically now your start cold tyre temp, or if you've got tyre warmers, that's effectively where you would start. Now, in order to play around with the internal tyre temp parameters, you click on here, edit thermal parameters. You go to the internal tyre temp settings. You'll click on deduce internal tyre temps, and you'll be putting in things like your hysteresis multiplier, your internal temp multiplier, your tyre mass, tread width, tread thickness, as we all discussed previously. Now, in terms of how you actually drive this, if we go into simulate tyre force modeling advanced, and we go into our internal temps. So again, this is basically this is what this is going to look like. So what I'll do to be very thorough about this, I'm going to click here to remove the model safeties. Click here for the slip ratio mode. So as you can tell, I'm just doing a 1 flying lap. I'm starting on a front tire pressure of 27 and a rear tire pressure of 30. Now, here's where things, to quote Captain Jack Sparrow, here's where things are going to get interesting. If you are determining those internal tyre temp parameters, what you'll be doing here is you'll be clicking on this and clicking on OK. And what that will happen is that will launch the ChassisSim driver. That will launch the ChassisSim track replay, where it will determine those internal temps. And all you got to do to apply that, click on the simulation, click on OK, and you're good to go. But if you're doing a normal track replay simulation, effectively this bit gets ignored, and what takes precedence is your start pressures that you've put in the vehicle model. And so that will go through and determine your internal tyre temp settings. One of the things that we found in testing is the fact that it's a really good idea to have the model safeties clicked, to remove the model safeties, and for the direct slip ratio mode, it just gives you the highest fidelity to make sure you're capturing everything. So that's a really, really good place to start. Now, as I've commented, and make sure, and particularly one thing that I'd also say, that when you're using this for your tire temperature work, in most cases when you're using the track replay simulation, you can get a little bit casual about what you call this target data file. When you are doing this to log tire temperatures, you've got to be a little bit robust about it. So you've got to be very deliberate in terms of what you're going to call the tire file, what you're going to call this results file, so you can easily access it. And to be quite honest, when you come to do it, all you've got to do is open it up in Excel and look at the last 4 columns, and you are good to go. Okay, now just a quick word. When you start to play with this and you do the auto modeling, from time to time you will get into a situation where where it doesn't quite hit its targets. Don't panic; it's not the end of the world. What you'll be doing is that you'll be playing around mostly with the internal temp multiplier. So if you basically land a little bit lower, you're going to be increasing this. And ditto for the hysteresis multiplier. Most cases you're going to be playing mostly with this, but if you really need to give it a bit of extra oomph, you play with the hysteresis multiplier. Now that just simply reflects the fact that no modeling is perfect, but I wanted to walk you through that so that just in case you're in a situation where it's not quite hitting its targets, you know what knobs to play with. Okie dokie. So, getting back to the presentation. Okay, how does tire pressure affect grip? The way that it affects grip is it's a multiplier of the traction circle radius. So to get to that, what you do is we go through the process that we worked before. Clicked on the tires, go to the tire temperature settings. You'll see here that little red line said click here for the traction circle radius multiplier. You bring that up and you've got tire pressure in terms of PSI, and you've got a force factor multiplier. Now, I'm going to sort of give you guys a little bit of an apology here. In a perfect world, I actually really should be representing that as the internal temperature of the tire, because that's actually that's what's actually the real thing that drives it. The harsh reality is that half of the teams out there don't have access to internal tire temps internal tire temp sensors. Now, where this is going to really make its presence felt is ChassisSim Driver in the Loop. And indeed, one of the things that we've really found with ChassisSim Driver in the Loop is that some of the nuances that would get lost in the lap time simulation really make their presence felt in Driver in the Loop. And in particular, we'll talk more about tire temperature surface modeling in the companion video to this, which will shortly follow this. So really, where this is going to make its presence felt is primarily with Driver in the Loop. However, before we actually discuss that, how do we quantify this from race data? Okay, so there are a couple of ways you can do this. Number one is if you've got more money than God, vis-a-vis you're a factory LMDH team, or you're a Formula One team, you can just strain gauge the car. You have different pressure gauges, and you put the model together from there. If you live in the real world and you don't have a budget of in excess of $200 million to run 4 race cars, a really good way is that you hold one end of the car constant tire pressure, and you sweep your tire and you sweep the tire pressure. So in this case, we've got a sweep from 26 through to 34 psi, and we've got our average AY through the lap, which starts at 1.8, 1.82, 1.83, 1.83, 1.81. This is not perfect, but what it does is it gives you a really good solid approximation of what that is. And again, just remember, ChassisSim's a calculator. It's not a magic wand. If you've got to make adjustments, make adjustments. Don't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, okay, well, we've done the magic test, therefore this is set in gold. This is a guide to get you going. Just remember, ChassisSim is a calculator. Use it as such. Okay, so let's have a little discussion about what affects tire pressures, because if I had $5 for every old wives' tale that I've heard about what affects tire pressures, I would not be presenting this video presentation today, ladies and gentlemen. I would be retired as a gentleman of leisure, living in a subtropical paradise, living the life of Riley. But I'm here with you, good folk. Okay, so here it is in terms of order of importance. You have your start pressures and your temps, which you ignore at your peril. Then you've got your driver inputs, then setup. Let me talk about the driver inputs, and in particular, this plot here that shows the comparison of the ChassisSim lap time simulation with a Muppet driving. And this particular Muppet happened to be myself. If we take a look at the bottom traces, this is the used tire energy. The coloured is the lap time simulation. The black is driver in the loop with the Muppet, our car myself. Take a look at how much more energy the amateur driver is actually throwing into those tires. Now that is going to have a huge knock-on effect for tire pressures, and to try and ignore that is a little bit like trying to ignore gravity. Once we're through that, then we take a look at setup, and here is, to quote Captain Jack Sparrow, this is where things got really, really interesting. So one of the things that we did when we were doing the development of this is we were doing it on the old live axle V8 supercars. Now we could do this for a number of reasons. In the fact that one of the go-to adjustments with the live axle supercars was the rear roll center adjustment. And one of the great wives' tales of V8 supercars is that as you raised rear roll center, the tire pressures at the rear would raise accordingly. But how does this stand up under closer scrutiny? So if we take a look at, we did a rear roll center sweep from 223 mil to 283 mil. And yeah, the rear tire pressures pretty much, and the front tire pressures would pretty much go the way you expected. The more you add rear roll center, the higher the tire pressures went. But take a look at these numbers in kilopascals. We started on 213.1. We landed at 214.27. So here was an increase of only of about 1.2. Here was a delta of 1.2 kilopascals, or a delta of about 0.2 to 0.3 of a psi. If we take a look at the spring rates half by 50%, again, it would go the way that you'd expect. The front tire pressures would drop by about 2 kilopascals, or about you'd be looking about 0.3, maybe 0.4 of a psi, and the rears dropped by about 1, which is about 0.2 or so of a psi. And again, the same thing when we went to 200%, it went the other way. But here's the thing. The numbers are a lot smaller than expected. And the reason they're smaller than expected, because what we were doing here was just simply using the track replay and running a whole bunch of changes. And if you drill down into what those loads were looking like when you would make those changes, you'd only be talking deltas of about plus or minus 20 kilos. And you just take one look and go, ooh, isn't that interesting? Now, here's the kicker though. As you start running through these changes, particularly with rear roll center, you're going to see big changes in stability index. And so consequently, the driver is going to be changing their imports accordingly. And that, folks, is the combination of those two, which is why you get to see the pressure increases that you have. But the setup in and of itself, while it certainly is not to be trifled with, it's not necessarily the big ticket item, albeit what you'd expect seeing something like this. You'd probably expect this expanded by about a factor of by about 2 or 3. And again, that's all down to basically what the driver's going to feel, in particular what they're going to feel in the stability index. So that's something that's really important to consider. Okay, so how do we link this to the lap time simulation? So if you go into circuit data, you've got a little tab here that says to simulate from cold temps and pressures. Click on here for the lap time simulation, and here it's basically a cut down version of what you see in the track replay. So you'll click here to enable the open loop sim for the tire warm up. You also can click here for asymmetric for if you want to do asymmetric stuff. So this is set up for ovals. Then you put in your monster file, click on OK, and what will happen is when you execute the lap time simulation, it'll do the track replay first to see where the tire pressures land. And then once the tire pressures land at a particular pressure, then it'll set the tire pressures constant, as we saw in this particular graph, and then just run the lap time simulation as standard. Now, I just want to say one thing about this. Use this with caution because of the analysis we did just a little while ago. So it will get you into the right area, but if you're looking for, say, if you are looking for huge hallelujah praise be Jesus changes, you're not going to find them. And for me to say otherwise would be, quite frankly, criminally negligent. That being said, stay tuned on this. This is a current work in progress with ChassisSim. But if you want to start playing with this, that's the knobs that you will play with. So let's wrap this up. Okay, tire pressure modeling is not as intimidating as you think. And indeed, one of the great things about ChassisSim is this has actually been part of ChassisSim probably since about 2014, albeit I've been rather reticent about how to connect the dots on this, and my apologies for that. The key thing is you turn on the internal temperature function, then you use the track replay for both modeling and the setup analysis, and This is going to be what sets up a full driver in the loop model. So at this point, let me conclude this tutorial. But don't take my word for it. Sign up for the ChassisSim online. Take a look at the ChassisSim bootcamps. Where particularly in the bootcamps, we're going to be talking about this at length. And we'll catch you in the next ChassisSim video tutorial.